In the early 20th century, electricians used several methods to identify wires. Firstly, they used color coding. While not widely adopted until the 1960s, some wires were color-coded, with black or red for hot and white for neutral. Secondly, electricians would tie different colored threads or tapes to wires to distinguish them. Thirdly, using a test lamp or voltmeter, electricians could test wires to determine their polarity, whether they were hot or neutral. Before the development of modern three-way switches, electricians would use a neutral wire as a switch leg to control a light fixture from multiple locations. This practice stopped in the 1960s, as it could create a safety hazard if the neutral wire became disconnected or open. In the 1920s and 1930s, electrical wiring was typically knob and tube, where insulated wires were run through ceramic knobs and tubes. This type of wiring made it easier to trace wires and identify their connections. Ungrounded electrical systems were common in older homes, meaning that there was no connection to the earth for protection against electrical faults. Electrical codes and standards have evolved significantly over time, resulting in safer and more reliable electrical installations. It's important to have any electrical work done by a qualified electrician who is familiar with current codes and best practices. If an electrician is working on a service change in a house built in the 1920s or 1930s, it is important to understand the techniques used at the time to identify wires and the potential safety hazards that may exist. Let's look closer at identifying wires. In the early days of electrical wiring, consistent color coding was not always followed. While black and red were often used for hot wires and white for neutral, this wasn't a universal standard. Electricians sometimes had to rely on other methods to determine the polarity of a wire. One common method was tying. Electricians would use different colored threads or tapes to mark wires and distinguish them from one another. This system allowed them to keep track of which wire was which, especially in complex wiring systems. Testing was another crucial method. Electricians would use a test lamp or voltmeter to check the wires and determine whether they were hot or neutral. A test lamp would light up when connected to a hot wire, while a voltmeter would provide a voltage reading. It's important to note that ungrounded electrical systems were common in older homes during this period. This means there was no connection to the earth for protection against electrical faults. As a result, electrical shocks were more common and potentially more dangerous. Now let's talk about the practice of using a neutral wire as a switch leg. Before modern three-way switches were developed, electricians sometimes used a neutral wire as a switch leg to control a light fixture from multiple locations. This practice was eventually discontinued due to safety concerns. If the neutral wire became disconnected or open, it could create a hazardous situation. The light fixture would still be energized, but the circuit would not be complete. This could lead to electrical shocks or even fires. The use of knob and tube wiring was typical in homes built in the 1920s and 1930s. This type of wiring involved running insulated wires through ceramic knobs and tubes. The knobs provided support for the wires, while the tubes protected them from damage. Knob and tube wiring made it easier to trace wires and identify their connections. However, it also had its limitations. The wires were not always properly insulated, and the system was prone to overheating. Over time, electrical codes and standards have evolved significantly. These changes have resulted in safer and more reliable electrical installations. It is now required to have grounded electrical systems which provide protection against electrical faults. Color coding of wires is also more standardized, making it easier to identify hot, neutral, and ground wires. Because electrical systems in older homes can be complex and potentially dangerous, it is important to have any electrical work done by a qualified electrician. A qualified electrician will be familiar with current codes and best practices, and they will be able to identify and address any safety hazards that may exist. When working on electrical systems in older homes, it is important to take extra precautions. Always turn off the power to the circuit before working on any wires or devices. Use a voltage tester to verify that the power is off. Wear appropriate personal protective equipment, such as gloves and eye protection. Be aware of the potential for asbestos, which was commonly used as insulation in older homes. If you suspect that asbestos is present, contact a qualified professional to have it removed. Here is some additional information about wire identification and safety in older homes. Wire identification in older homes can be challenging due to the lack of consistent color coding. Here are some tips for identifying wires. Firstly, use a voltage tester to check for hot wires. Hot wires will typically have a voltage reading of 120 volts or 240 volts, depending on the circuit. Secondly, look for white or grey wires, which are typically neutral wires. However, be aware that neutral wires may sometimes be used as switch legs in older homes. Thirdly, check for bare copper wires, which are typically ground wires. Ground wires provide a path for electricity to flow back to the source in the event of a fault. Here are some safety tips for working on electrical systems in older homes. Firstly, always turn off the power to the circuit before working on any wires or devices. Secondly, use a voltage tester to verify that the power is off. Thirdly, wear appropriate personal protective equipment such as gloves and eye protection. Fourthly, be aware of the potential for asbestos, which was commonly used as insulation in older homes. Fifthly, if you suspect that asbestos is present, contact a qualified professional to have it removed. Sixthly, never work on electrical systems if you are not qualified to do so. Always hire a qualified electrician to perform electrical work. When dealing with electrical systems in older homes, it's crucial to understand the historical context and the practices that were common during the time the house was built. This knowledge, combined with a thorough inspection and adherence to safety precautions, can help ensure that electrical work is performed safely and effectively. The evolution of electrical codes and standards has significantly improved the safety and reliability of electrical installations over time. By understanding the past and staying up to date with current best practices, electricians can provide safe and efficient service to homeowners, regardless of the age of their homes. Always consult with a qualified electrician for any electrical work, especially in older homes, to ensure safety and compliance with current codes. Remember that working with electricity can be dangerous, and it's always best to leave it to the professionals.